Good evening, everyone. Good evening, sir. I'm Malvika. On behalf of NALSAR, its alumni and its students, so I must thank you for taking the time out today to share your valuable insight into criminal jurisprudence. Our speaker today really needs no introduction. Mr. Siddharth Luthra is a senior advocate and former Solicitor General of India of the Supreme Court. He is an alumnus of Delhi University and the University of Cambridge and is currently a visiting professor at Northumbria University in the United Kingdom, and has also spent time teaching at judicial academies and government agencies across the country. Arguably one of the finest criminal lawyers in the country, Mr. Luthra has spent almost 3 decades at the bar now. Few, if indeed any, criminal lawyers have had the opportunity to work on the variety of seminal matters that he has over the past 3 decades. Who can forget the Justice Soumitra Sen case or the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case, or more recently, the 2015 cash for vote scam or Nirbhaya. Today's topic for the lecture that he's doing for us will be theories of punishment and variance in sentencing. You can leave your questions at any point in time during the seminar in the chat box. And right at the end, I'll put a few to him. The webinar will be played on YouTube and some other platforms after this. I think that's about it. Well, sir, without further ado, I pass the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Malvika. Having worked with Malvika for a while, it is very difficult to say no to her. She's a very, very persuasive counsel, and therefore I had no option. But apart from that, I enjoy this. For me, it's a journey that I've had, and this journey is part of this journey is to share what I understand about the law. These may not necessarily be views which you will concur with. These may be views which you believe. You may believe differently, and I'm glad and I'm happy if I can generate that discussion, and that's what this conversation is about. It's the view of a person who wanted to be an academic but got into the legal profession by chance, or remained in the legal profession by chance. Otherwise, I think I would have been happier off teaching law. But here I am, and you will therefore have to suffer or deal with my understanding of the law. Today's topic is a little different. In fact, when Malvika talked to me about this, I thought this was going to be very easy, because what she was going to do was make me speak about something which I've written a paper on. And I thought this is going to be very simple, so I don't need to work so hard. But Malvika comes from a chamber where they work very hard, and therefore you're made to work hard if you are interacting with them. And I've had to apply my mind a little more and think about all that I've considered done. Now, today's talk is about punishment and theories of punishment and the problem with variances of sentencing. So one of the things I want to share with you is, what is punishment? After all, that's the fundamental issue. If you consider what Manu says, and Manu is now increasingly being quoted in the last few decades, Manu says, and I quote, "Punishment governs all mankind. Punishment alone preserves them. Punishment wakes while guards are asleep, and the wise consider the punishment that's done as the perfection of justice." Now, that was Manu a long time ago in the Manusmriti. The meaning of punishment is really a pain, a discomfort to a person for what we in society classify as a misdeed and give it the force of law. We recognize it as a breach of social norms, but punishable under law. In the Indian Penal Code, we have section 53, which talks about the kinds of punishment. So punishment may be, simply put, it may be fine, there may be imprisonment or fine, or there may be life imprisonment or death imprisonment, and imprisonment can be simple or rigorous. Of course, there can also be forfeiture of property. Of late, there is a great emphasis on section 357 and its attendant sections, which are 357A, B, and C, because compensation has taken a very relevant, sorry, you want me to increase the volume? Hello? Can you
It's
hear
all,
me, guys?
it's all right.
Malvika, I couldn't, I think your screen had frozen.
I think one or two people are having issues, sir, but overall it seems to be okay. Maybe if you can speak a little closer to your mic.
No, I'm, okay, because I'm speaking fairly close to the mic, I'm on this now.
We can hear
And
you. Everybody can
you
hear
can hear me? You can hear me? So as I said, punishment. And I'll go back to the point where I was dealing with section 53, that section 53 in the IPC talks about a few kinds of punishment. There's life imprisonment, there's death, there is imprisonment, rigorous or simple. There is also forfeiture of property. And lastly, there used to be transportation of life. So if you remember the Andaman and Nicobar, it used to be called Kala Pani. People used to be transported for life, which later became a life. I don't know if you're aware, but apart from Andaman and Nicobar, there is one more cellular jail in India. I don't know if you're aware of it, but let me share with you. It is in the Sainik School, Dagshai, where you have a cellular jail. It is maintained today as a museum. It is one of those rare cellular jail which still exists, but of course it's part of the school now. I wonder if when the students get naughty, they're sent into the cellular jail. I'm not sure whether it is, but we'll have to find that out. There is also a great emphasis now, as I said earlier, on compensation. So section 357, section 357 capital A, B, and C, these are very important provisions now where sentencing is now coupled with compensation. I must tell you, about 25, 30 years ago, my wife Katie was doing a case where, in a case of economic fraud, this is early 90s, where a penalty of 72 lakhs had been imposed. It was the scandal, judicial scandal almost of the times, where it was stayed for the asking because nobody could contemplate such compensation being granted, because compensation used to be in the pittance. There was no concept of compensation, though section 357 did exist on the CRPC. The CRPC, so therefore, has a fascinating range. You know, the minimal sentence is 24 hours, what we often call till the rising of the court, but there is a provision, I think it's 50510, which talks about 24 hours, and the maximum sentence, of course, is death. This punishment that we award a person has to have a correlation to the crime, and that's what criminologists and social scientists talk about. In my master's in criminology, I had a fascinating experience. I was taught by a lawyer, by a psychologist, England's top criminal psychologist at the time, Donald West and Adrian Grounds. And I was taught by a psychiatrist, I was taught by a sociologist, and by a philosopher. I'm going to end by a quote by that philosopher, Professor Nigel Walker. So today the point is, this understanding of crime and punishment, while we know that we are trying to, crime is to be punished, there is no clear-cut, precise approach, and there is always an experimentation which is going on, and there are different theories which have been propounded. Amongst those, as you know, the four theories are deterrent, retributive, preventive, and reformative. But none of these theories actually hold the field badly. So there is, in a sense, an incoherence in our philosophical moorings of punishment, and that leads to aberrations in sentencing, because sentencing being a pure matter of discretion, we run into issues. We must not forget that, you know, there may be a minimum sentence, there may not be a minimum, and these variations happen. Now, one of the peculiarity of sentencing is this, and there are factors which you will not even see written in the statute books. In the case of a person who's convicted for an offense, till 3 years, the right of bail at the stage of appeal exists. But if it is more than 3 years, you have no right of bail in appeal. Effectively, if it's a 3-year sentence, the convicting court will grant you bail pending appeal. It's called bail daira appeal. And once you file the appeal, then you have a right to get, and there's a judgment in that called Sudhir Kumar Jain, which I had argued way back, one of the early judgments cases I did when I had become a senior counsel in 2007. There are, of course, other judgments to that effect also. So this changes a judge's outlook. If you recall, and perhaps this was before your time, when Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, the former Prime Minister of India, was being tried way back in the 90s, I believe it was the JMM case, an issue arose, what is the sentence he will be imposed? And Tihar Jail set up a row of 6 rooms where, for VIP prisoners, where a former Prime Minister had to be kept, possibly if he was convicted for more than 3 years, and he had to be kept there with a sentence. If it would be more than 3 years, he had to go to jail till his appeal was filed till the appellate court gave him relief. So these 6 rooms were created, and the VIP rooms remain a testimony to the fact that 3 years cutoff becomes very important. But this 3 years cutoff has nothing to do with reformation, deterrence, retribution, or prevention. It has to do with the pragmatism of a judge, whether to send certain people inside jail at the stage of appeal or not, or at the stage of conviction. And that's what it turns. And therefore, as I said, the philosophical moorings of sentencing have certain concerns. When we look at sentencing and punishment, there are 2 schools of thought. The classical school, where there's a legal definition of crime. The punishment is to fit the crime. We believe that people acted with the doctrine of free will, and death penalty was also awarded. And there was no empirical research done as to determine what was the purpose, what is the purpose behind offenses, what is the basis for offenses, why should acts be categorized offenses, and what should the sentence be. The modern thought is the positive school, which says, look, the old definition goes, today we have to have a punishment which fits the criminal. We have to consider abolishing the death penalty, and we must determine criminality and sentencing based on empirical research, and therefore there will be variable sentencing to fit not just the circumstances of the crime, but the circumstances of the criminal or the offender. So let's come back to the 4 theories of punishment. The first is deterrent. The deterrent theory was to discourage people from committing crime. So you gave a very strong punishment so people would not think of committing a crime. You would put the fear of punishment into them. And that is the whole purpose. It is to warn not only that individual, but it is also to send out a message to society at large. In the Nirbhaya case, I was asked this question after the judgment was over and the sentence was given, as to whether there would at all be a deterrence as a result of the Nirbhaya case. And my response, and I maintain that response, is why I introduce the concept of collective conscience of society as the principle for grant of sentence in the Nirbhaya case, in death cases, yet at the same time, and not only just death cases, yet at the same time, the effect of this will have to be seen over the next 5 years, looking at statistics of prosecution, investigations, prosecutions, and ultimate convictions till the Supreme Court. And since our system is slow, as a matter of fact, these things take a little time. So the deterrent theory is the basis for punishment in England, in the UK, in the medieval period, and sometimes even for small offenses, inhuman and severe punishments were given. Certain countries which believe in Sharia law, like Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, adopt the deterrent theory as the basis of their penal jurisprudence. It's a matter of their philosophical and jurisprudential moorings, and it's a matter of choice. Individual deterrence is an important element here, which refers to the effect of punishment on the individual. So this is a focus on the individual to make sure the individual doesn't commit crime. The second part, as I said earlier, is what is called general deterrence, where you're trying to send a message out to society that crimes do not pay, and that human beings who are rational beings ought to get the on the basis of the conviction and sentence of one individual, which is publicized, informed, so that people get a message that this is the kind of severity of punishment that you can be awarded. And therefore, there is a terror amongst evildoers and a warning to others who attempt to imitate them. Then you have the retributive theory. a very interesting concept. It has its basis, the origin, in the instinct, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The crude animal instinct of the group to retaliate when hurt. Retribution, of course, says severity must be proportionate to gravity of the offense. The whole purpose is to restore the social balance disturbed by the offender, that the offender should suffer as much pain as the victim, and there must be a message sent to the offender that what you have taken, you must give back in your suffering by pain, and the balance is then to be set right in society. This, of course, is now considered a vindictive approach, an unfortunate approach, and it is not accepted by modern thinkers, though it does creep into Indian jurisprudence all the time. We also have the preventive theory, where you want not to avenge the crime, but to prevent it, to pull out of the stops, to remove a person from society. The idea is place the offender out of harm's way. And this is sometimes seen in the concept of recidivism, where we believe that people who are not likely to commit crime, who are not likely to be recidivists, a crime after the first conviction, should be let out from society, should be given lesser punishments, but others should be given a higher punishment if you believe there is no scope for reformation. So this is the preventive theory. And here, because you are putting people in jail and giving them custodial sentences where they can be avoided, you are really creating a hardening of the criminal, especially in the context of juvenile offenders. So I would say that one of the amendment from the age 16 to 18 and giving discretion to the courts may give rise to application of the preventive theory, because there was a belief, and I don't necessarily concur with it, that people between 16 to 18 may or may not have the knowledge as to the act is what we seek to apply in modern philosophy. And so Reformation treats a person like a patient and looks at his social economic milieu. So you try and see what's the background of the offender. Is the crime his crime, or is it a summation, excuse me, of its causative factors? And what is the reason? Can we reform the person? Can we rehabilitate the person? Can we bring about a change in the mindset of this individual so as to rehabilitate him or her as a law-abiding member of society? Here we are looking at the moral reform of the offender. So that is the reason you have jails like Tihar, where people are taught Vipassana, taught crafts, arts, industry, they're taught work, they're given opportunities to educate them. The purpose is to see, can we get them out of the proclivity to commit crime? A Supreme Court judgment, Yasuddin versus Andhra Pradesh, makes a very interesting point, and I'll quote that line. And I read, crime is a pathological aberration. The criminal can orderly be redeemed, and the state has to rehabilitate rather than avenge. The subculture that leads to antisocial behavior has to be countered not by undue cruelty, but by reculturalization. No discussion of sentencing can be complete without a discussion of the life sentence, because that's a very important example of the nature of sentence. And I want to tell you how it's developed in terms of jurisprudence. So you had the original view of transportation of life. You were taken from here and sent to Andaman and Nicobar and not to be brought back. This was the kind of concept that the British did in their colonies, where people were sent to Australia or other colonies and kept there for the rest of their natural life. The second category, and this category was accepted, as I said, in the Gopal Vinayak Godse's case, to say life meant till the end of natural life. The second category developed as a matter of practice was in life, that life was treated as 12 years to 14 years. This practice continued for a long time. Till in 2008, in Swami Shraddhanand's case, there was a concern that you can't have this kind of aberration, and then a new category of sentencing was carved out, which is sentences of life, but for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, as the case may be, without remission. This debate went on till it was upheld by the Constitution Bench in 2016 in the Sriharan case, which is the Rajiv Gandhi assassins case. And it's an important judgment because the issue of variable sentences impacted scores of cases. It gives the judge an opportunity to reduce it from life, from death to life or part of life. Now this becomes very crucial because today the judge, we've already categorized death to be the rarest of rare cases. So if the rarest of rare can be avoided by giving an intermediate sentence, let's say an offender is 60 or 70 years of age. You give him life till natural life, which means he or she will spend the rest of their life possibly in jail. 30 years without remission means the person will live till 90, which really means. And if the person comes out in 90, he or she is not going to be harmful to society at that age, incapable of doing harm, yet at the same time, it is not the death sentence. So intermediate sentencing in terms of Sriharan are a very important parameter for consideration, and they have laid down this new norm which has become very important. I must share with you one of the recent cases that I did, Anokhi Lal, that now of course it's been remanded to the trial court, remained pending for this very purpose because a lot of these death penalty cases kept pending till Sriharan was decided, and now Sriharan, in the event of a remand or even at sentencing, changes the parameters of sentencing. But no parameters get laid down even in Sriharan. Now, in the absence of these parameters, we have a serious concern of sentencing discrimination. Article 14 of our Constitution says everybody should be treated equally, yet sentencing being a matter of discretion, you find that judges treat sentencing differently. Some apply retribution, some apply deterrence. Retribution, in fact, sometimes leads to a lesser sentence. Some apply reformation, and some judges give death penalty. So in the decade, which is 2000 to 2008-9, you had two sets of judges, both with different philosophies. Before one bench, the chance of a death sentence was about 90%, a death sentence being confirmed. Before the other bench, the chance of a death being commuted to life was about 90% or 80%. And this has been reported even in popular magazines. This philosophy allows the creeping in of variables, and inconsistency occurs when sentencers are not clear as to what is the approach to be taken. The worst type of inconsistency is that today one sentencer chooses a lesser sentence because of rehabilitation, the other increases the sentence, and this becomes a matter of individual philosophy, your life experiences, your approach, and whether it is severity, liability, guilty mind, or the circumstances of the accused or the circumstance of the offense, all of these become a byproduct or an end product rather of the judge's mind, his personal choices, philosophies, and considerations. And this is most reflected in the death sentence. I remember while arguing Nirbhay, there was one judgment, and I will not, you can find it yourselves. There was one judgment which I was reading, and I was very satisfied with it. It seemed to be one of the best judgments to seek a confirmation of the death sentence. Till at the last stage, the judgment changes and awarded life. There seemed no rationale for changing of life till I spoke to one of the judges later, and he had mentioned to me that his brother judge was at the last minute balked at the idea of putting in a death sentence because he in his career had never given a death sentence. And therefore, while the whole rationale of the decision was towards death sentence, the ultimate conclusion was life. What does a trial judge do with such a judgment? What does a trial judge do with judgments which on facts go both ways? And this becomes a serious concern because while considering aggravating factors, mitigating circumstances, we will find that there are judgments both ways. And these both way judgments, as we all know, create a lot of problem for lawyers and judges alike. Because there are no such guidelines to assist the trial court in meting out punishment, we have a resulting disparity. And then, firstly, the accused is unhappy. Often the victim is unhappy because now the victim has a major role in our criminal justice system. And thirdly, there is a reaction by society as well. Society also has a concern about the nature of sentence that is or is not imposed. And especially now, every day at 9 prime time television, or 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. every day, we're all determining. And if you look at the newspapers today, well, of course, these days nobody looks at newspapers with COVID around. But if you were to look at the newspapers pre-COVID period, you would find at least the first 2 or 3 pages deal with legal news, and a substantial portion of them, or majority of them, relate to criminal law. And that is the level of sensitivity that society now has to matters of criminal prosecutions and criminal cases. And if there is inconsistent decision making, if there are faulty rationales, the need for a sentencing policy is felt more and more in our system, because now it is becoming apparent to all of us that there is a gap in sentencing discretion being exercised. Elester Pereira is a classic case. If you remember, that's the case of an accident. And I want to quote a passage from there. Sentencing policy, and I quote, is an important task in the matters of crime. One of the prime objectives of the criminal law is imposition of appropriate, adequate, and just, please note the word just, and proportionate sentence commensurate with the nature and gravity of crime and the manner in which crime is done. There is no straitjacket formula for sentencing an accused on proof of crime. The courts have evolved certain principles. Twin objectives of sentencing is deterrence and correction. Please note, deterrence and correction. What sentence would meet the ends of justice depends on the facts and circumstances of each case, and the court must keep in mind the gravity of crime, motive for the crime, nature of the offense, and all other attendant circumstances. The principle of proportionality in sentencing a crime doer is well entrenched in criminal jurisprudence. As a matter of law, proportion between crime and punishment bears most relevant influence in determination of sentencing the crime doer. The court has to take consideration all aspects, including social interest and consciousness of society, for award of the appropriate sentence. Now, if you look at this passage, it talks about just deserts, retribution. It talks about reformation. It talks about deterrence, and it talks about the principle of proportionality. What does a court below the Supreme Court make with the 4 concepts which are all in this paragraph? And there are judgments replete like this which will say the very same thing. And I must tell you, the categorization of whether 1 person has died or 4 persons have died, the categorization whether a cheating is being committed against 20 people or 30 people, all these variations occur. The amount of cheating becomes a variation. The punishment may be the same in entirety, but the quantum involved, whether of human loss or of financial loss, is now increasingly becoming a parameter not just for compensation, but more of a parameter for increasing or decreasing the amount of imprisonment. And this leads to sentencing disparity. In other cases, the age of offender, chances of reformation, they are considered as mitigating cases and factors in some matters. In other cases, they are ignored as mitigating factors. So when judges deal with people with similar identical criminal histories, or they impose similar sentences or for offenders with different antecedents, can there be fairness in the system? And this fairness is now becoming a great matter of concern. In a 1971 decision, Rameshwar Dayal versus State of Uttar Pradesh, the Supreme Court actually considers this and complains and reviews the fact that there are variant sentences given for similar offenses, similar conduct, and that becomes a matter of such a concern. So I will tell you, friends, there are two things which need to be considered vis-a-vis sentencing policy. Firstly, as I said earlier, there must be uniformity. Similar offenders, similarly placed offenders must get roughly the similar punishment. This is imperative because sentencing serves a social purpose both for the victim, the accused, and for society at large. There must be certainty. It's part of Article 14 and Article 21. Secondly, there has been a desire to rationalize sentencing policies based on public opinion. There is a view that we should take the public's view into consideration. Nirbhay's case, Mukesh Kumar, talks about the collective conscience of society, but says judges must consider when the collective conscience demands a death sentence or the highest punishment. This is the case. Then surely we will have to examine whether in India we can do a broad-based discussion on sentencing guidelines and mechanisms to impose sentencing. United Kingdom, USA have done a lot of research to measure inconsistency in sentencing, either vertically or horizontally, to consider this. Solve it with sentencing guidelines or with sentencing councils. But in India, this is really a judge-driven measure. As I said, you have life sentences which are now determined in terms of the Sriharan case. Now, all these judgments that we have from the Supreme Court lay down certain patterns, guidelines, suggestions. But these suggestions cannot take the place of statutory obtained guidelines while leaving discretion to the judge to determine what is the nature of sentence to be imposed. Similarly, we also have to consider increasing the discretion of sentence statutorily in relation to fines that are imposed. Compensation, of course, exists. And the whole purpose is that while we believe that individualized sentencing is important, if it leads to incoherence, then we have a problem. Andrew Ashworth, who's a very major thinker in the field of criminal law and sentencing, says that the problem occurs because you have different penal philosophies amongst judges and magistrates, and you need a clearly defined rationale. Let it be rehabilitation, let it be retribution or deterrence. But as I pointed out in Lester Pereira, you have all four almost clubbed into one paragraph in a decision. Till we have a coherent philosophy, we will have interjudicial disparity and we will have aberrant sentencing, and this variability will give rise, as I said even earlier, to individual decision making. In England, USA and Wales, you have sentencing councils and they point out what are the aggravating, what are the mitigating factors, and they give you parameters for sentencing. My view, of course, is that sentencing disparity is something which has been there in every system, and various techniques have been adapted to try and reduce it. So one of the issues will be establishing sentencing principles, sentencing guidelines, reimposing judicial self-regulation, and prescribing mandatory minimum sentences. Now, if you have these kind of parameters, and I don't necessarily agree with that concept, you will at least reduce the variations. Therefore, I would really conclude by saying that we live in an era of discretion, and in my personal view, we will have to need to get out, have a discretion which is tempered reasoning and just arbitrary discretion. So there are scores of examples I can give to you when there have been protests on the streets of Delhi or in the streets of other cities. And what does that lead to? So sometimes when sentencings are lesser, there are public marches, there is anger in society, there are candlelight marches, and there is protest in society. Whether the protest is valid or not is a separate issue. But the fact is that society is reacting to what it believes is the uncertainty of decision making. If that be the case, surely he must have certainty. So one of the simple suggestions that I would make to all of you to think about, because I'm not a legislator, hopefully soon some of you will be, do we need guidelines? Do we need a sentencing council to advise on sentencing? Do we need to further training for judicial personnel to understand what should be the parameters and that extraneous material ought not to be considered? Should we not have social workers, psychiatrists, allied disciplines introduced within the ambit of the criminal law, criminal procedure to assist judges in decision making? We don't use our probation officers enough. We don't get reports pre-sentencing. In the Nirbhaya case, this was one of the grievances. And the Supreme Court called for a report, gave them time to file affidavits, and then determined the sentencing after a complete hearing. Fines need to be revised under the Penal Code, because these fines were imposed way back in the 1860s. And the aggravating and mitigating factors need to be fine-tuned and need to have uniformity. So I'm going to close that today. And now I'm going to leave the floor open to all of you for questions. I hope I was able to be heard clearly. Thank you very much.
Hi. Sorry, sir, your video is slightly breaking, but hopefully everybody else can hear me. Sir, can you hear me?
Malvika, just no, I know what I'll do. That'll disconnect. Just hold on. Just hold on. Just a minute. Let's try and just a minute. I wonder if this will help. Just
I'll just put some of the questions that some of the attendees had to you, sir. Question number 1.
just
Okay.
give me.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, Malvika, I hope is this better? Is the video better now?
The audio is better now.
Is the video better now?
The video is also fine.
I hope these guys have been able to hear me. I don't know if they have.
Little bit in the middle it cracked, sir, but mostly it was okay.
That's all right. I mustn't have been making sense in any way.
I'll just put some of the questions to you, sir.
Sure.
First one, what are the benefits and consequences of mandatory minimum sentences? Do they help in eliminating sentencing discrimination, or do they only enhance the existing problem?
I think mandatory minimum sentences are indicator to a judge that as to what he or she should not go below. But you can't just tweak sentencing policy by adding one element. I think and all of these elements need to be tested. So I would first say that we have mandatory minimum sentencing, let's say in corruption cases. What is the consequence of that? Has it done away with corruption at all? The answer is no. In fact, what do judges do? When you create a minimum, sometimes matters are dragged on and delayed, especially when the offenders are elderly, because courts don't want to send people to custody for a mandatory minimum sentence. And this is a practical problem we see. The other concern I have is that how do you compare, as I said, a crime where a person robs a loaf of bread, theft, or robs jewelry? Let's say you have a mandatory minimum there. Can you treat the two crimes similarly? Now, one person, let me give you a more classic example. Let's say today you have a migrant laborer who robs a cycle from you to get back to his village in Jharkhand. And then you have a person who steals your laptop because he needs to, use it to feed his habits, by way of example. Can you treat both the offenders similarly in terms of sentencing? The answer obviously is not. So therefore, when we tweak with sentencing policies, when we tweak with sentencing, it has to have a larger ramification. We can't just do it selectively by adding. The biggest problem that we have faced in this country is that we've had a lot of reactive criminal law. We reacted to Nirbhaya, we got the 2013 amendment. We reacted to other offenses, we made the punishment greater in POCSO. We reacted to NDPS, we made it more stringent. We reacted to terrorism, we made certain offenses more stringent. We had Bombay, we brought in the NIA, we increased the offense punishment, and we brought in a lot of provisions in the UAPA. While punishment and crime is to deal with aberrant conduct, at the same time, we must not forget that we are not just looking at aberrant conduct of arising from a certain parameter, but there has to be a larger picture. And that larger picture needs to be seen. Therefore, my point really is mandatory minimum. Let's take the example of probation. There's Avantika says, probation has never been, is rarely given. The fact is, probation has been on your statute book over 150 years ago, more than that. It's been in the old CRPC, there's a statute. How often do you see probation given by the trial courts? How often do you see admonition given? Why? So one of the fundamentals is, it's time to train our judges as to what's available to them. It's time to then give them legislatively ordained parameters of sentencing. What ought to be a minimum, what ought to be the maximum, and then circumstances where they can exercise discretion to go below the minimum. Maximum is, of course, defined in all statutes. I don't think that the only thing a mandatory minimum does it makes the judge's job easy. But that's not what sentencing is about. Sentencing is about ensuring that there is a balance. And we need to also be clear, as I said at the start of this, we need to be clear, what is our philosophy? Does it change from offense to offense? In Mukesh Kumar Nirbhay, or in a murder case, rape and murder, does it become retributive? Because that's what the collective cry of conscience of society is. Or does it become deterrent in such cases, whereas in other cases it becomes reformative? So we may also need to categorize crime. So, you know, what we call crime, we already have a distinction in the CRPC 437, which says 7 years and below and 7 years and above. 7 years and below, you even give the magistrate a power to grant bail. You have also 41A, 41B, 41C, 41D. So 7 years is a very important criteria. If 7 years is such an important criteria, then why don't we use the 7-year test, which is also there in plea bargaining, to say 7 years and below, we will treat as crime where there is a scope of reformation. Definitely. For crime between 7 and 10 or 7 and onwards, we will treat it differently depending on the circumstances. So you'll have two sets of cases. One is to, as I said, a recidivist, a person who's a prior offender but has not committed, let's say, murder, but now commits it. And the person is believed after psychiatric and psychological tests incapable of reform. And then you have another man or another woman who commits murder in self-defense. Many, many years ago, my late father was doing a case where, you know, there were these people, who are illegal, who make illegal alcohol in and around Delhi. They're a tribe. They used to be one of the, I forget the name, they used to be one of the Sansis. They were supposed to be one of the tribes criminalized by the British. Now there was a Sansi boy who was being tried for a criminal case. The other family members were also tried. Later, I managed, my father got the first family members off and I got the boy off later. So the Sansi boy was committed murder of a non-Sansi man, and he was being prosecuted for murder. And you know what he had killed the man with? He had killed the man with a scissor. When asked why he killed the man with the scissor, he said, "This man used to come and harass my sister every day. I couldn't bear it beyond a point. My sister was to be married. I told him to stop. He didn't. So I and my young friends went. I didn't have any other weapon. My mother had a big scissor. You know, those times you had those large scissors, metal scissors, those metal iron scissors. He says, I took them. I unscrewed it. And that was as good an offense as any. That was as good a weapon as any. And I just killed him because I had warned him. He didn't listen. So I did. Now, are you going to treat him similar to a person who commits what we call, I mean, this is also cold-blooded murder. But are you going to treat it similarly if he is charged and convicted with murder as a person who is, let's say, does it without remorse? This man also had no remorse. Or a person who does it, let's say, for commercial, dacoity and murder, a person who does it for commercial gain. These are philosophical issues which we need to deal with. And, you know, these become very important. In fact, I had to, you know, there was a very classical statement that my late professor, Nigel Walker, used to say about sentencing, and I will just read that out to you while we come to the next question. But there's one very interesting thing which he said. Let me just find it in my notes. But tell me, what's the next question?
Sir, since you were speaking about how finding our core philosophy of punishment is really should be our primary aim, there are competing questions amongst the attendees. One of our attendees wants to know how relevant you think the Gandhian philosophy is to laws relating to punishment, whether punishing the sin and not the sinner really helps in reforming the offender. But there is another attendee who wants to understand whether it's economically viable to even try as such a large state to try to reform, say, rape convicts who have done something that's clearly wrong and such great injustice to the victim. So how do we reconcile these two competing philosophies?
Let me now explain one thing to you. We begin with the philosophy that a rape convict has done something wrong. Is a murder convict not done something wrong? You're willing to reform the murderer, but not the rape convict. I tell you, the reason to reform is twofold. All crime is bad. All hurt crime is bad. The reason to reform both is because if the purpose of reformation is not just the improvement of the individual, but the improvement of the individual to enable him or her to come back and become a useful member of society. If that be your parameter of reformation, then it has to apply across board. Then you can't apply it based on your own likes or dislikes. And that becomes this like and dislike concept is what I find troublesome when we deal with sentencing, and that enters our judicial determination and our philosophies and our submissions in court. So that was point number one. On the Gandhian philosophy, so the Gandhian philosophy says, look at the sin and not the sinner. That's absolutely right, but that's what we're doing. When we look at the circumstances of we punish the crime. But when it comes to the prisoner, in order to ensure that we are not just mindlessly punishing the crime, we look at the circumstances of the criminal. And that becomes a very important consideration. You know, my late professor, Nigel Walker, used to had a very interesting quote about sentencing. And he used to say, if the criminal law as a whole is the Cinderella of jurisprudence, then the law of sentencing is Cinderella's illegitimate child. Because it is the most ignored, unwanted area of the law, at least in countries like India. And I see it is unwanted and ignored because it is replete with ad hocism. And it is, according to me, the most important part of criminal law, because till you determine your philosophy and punish accordingly, you are doing great injustice to the whole institution of criminal law.
A slightly more practical question now, sir, from one of our attendees. How and at what stage do you prefer an application under Section 357 of the CRPC on behalf of a victim? Should it be by virtue of an intervention application on behalf of a victim?
I would recommend that you all read Rekha Murarka's case. Rekha Murarka today defines the rights victims have in the Criminal Procedure Code. That's a recent decision. I had occasion to do it. And I believe that the issue of compensation must be addressed obviously at the stage of sentencing. It can't be addressed before that. So the moment the conviction is done, sentencing must be, at the stage of sentencing itself, compensation must be addressed. If the prosecutor prosecutor should be imposed upon to address it. And if he is not, and if the accused or if the victim wants to make a point, that will have to be in terms of Rekha Murarka's case. You, in any case, as a victim, have a right to seek to file written submissions at the final argument stage, and you can always move an application through the prosecutor, asking for sentencing. And if the prosecutor does not agree to put that point forward, with the permission of the court, it can be done. Rekha Murarka is the 2019 decision. Justice Deepak Gupta's. Justice Shantana Gaudar, who wrote the judgment, and Deepak Gupta was with him.
Another connected question, sir. Section 357, subsection 3 of the CRPC allows the sentencing court to award compensation even in cases where the offense is not punishable with fine. Yes. Magistrates have limited powers to order fines, and there is a cap on the amount of fine which different magistrates are empowered to award. Mm-hmm. But their power to compensation is unregulated. So how do we reconcile?
No, the reason for this is because compensation is, okay, fine can lead to a punishment in lieu of the fine. That is, there can be an alternate punishment. However, compensation is to balance the loss to the individual, and that is not equivalent to fine unless it's 357(1). This is in the context, let's say, of Negotiable Instruments Act. The issue was, how do you justify making payment of double the amount? And they treated it as, they discussed compensation aspect when they justified how the double the amount is to be taken. Secondly, compensation is recoverable as arrears of land revenue. Nobody goes to jail for non-payment of compensation, non-payment of compensation. So there are two different issues. Compensation is the financial recompense. Fine is part of the punishment, and there can be, and as we all know, there is imprisonment in lieu of fine.
I'll let this be the last question, sir, and then we can wrap up. I'll send you, there are lots of questions. I'll send them over to you on email and you can answer them.
You did not wait for me to offer that. I'll take your questions in email. Thank you so much.
You're still open to, sir. We can, I mean, I'm sure everybody will be more than happy to stay on the call and continue.
No, that's all.
Last question.
You assume that I would entertain all. You assume that that I'm willing to answer them all. No, I'm happy to answer them all. That's what I said. You're a very tough customer, Malvika.
Last question, so I promise. To what crimes can we include community service as an option for punishment in India?
Very good question. I think community service should be included for at least all crimes up till 7 years imprisonment, and especially summons cases, it should be a matter of norm. I don't see why community service can't be made part of variable sentencing even for harsher offenses. So you may not do it in a life sentence case, but even if it's a 10-year case, why can't you balance community service with the punishment and make it a composite issue? Because remember, community service will also have another benefit. It will enable you to see whether there is reformation or not. After all, with probation, community service can be tied in. Today, there is, I'll give you a classic, a very interesting example. You know, in I think 2007, 6 or 7, I did a very interesting matter before Justice Manmohan Singh and Justice Manju Gupta in the High Court, if I'm not mistaken. And the issue was, I was appointed amicus to assist in a number of matters that in cases of rape, whether you could have, or life sentence cases, I don't think they were, yeah, there were also cases of rape, whether you could have variable sentences. Now the issue was the statute doesn't permit community service or things like that. So we looked at all these aspects and tried to work out a mechanism, and eventually the court asked people to file undertakings based on their sentence could be between 10 years to 14 years. This is the pre-Shraddhanand and Sriharan cases. So today, your biggest handicap is judges, when they look at policy, they are often impacted by the cases that they are dealing with. Whereas the government, and I'm not a great votary that government makes good laws necessarily, but I believe that when government legislates, it has the ability to listen to many more stakeholders than the limited stakeholders that there are available in court. And the more the stakeholders, the better informed the decision is. It may require tweaking, and parliamentary processes often are slow, but it becomes important that these processes must be a greater deliberative process. I remember when the Malimat committee was doing its deliberations, they went all over India, right or wrong, but they went all over India. They heard stakeholders, even if they heard a microcosm of the population in each area, but they did. And that's not necessarily possible for a court to determine in a 1-hour hearing while they're laying down guidelines. There are some areas, for example, procedural issues and other issues, where courts can lay down guidelines. But if you remember the beautiful 7-judge bench decision in P. Ramachandra Rao, they said you can't have judicially engrafted parameters necessarily. And I believe that is the correct approach in law. You can lay down broad understanding of the law, but not specific examples, because these instances are going to occur in a variety of situations.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for taking the time out to do this for us. I shall
collate. Let me just see if there's some question. No, hold on. Let me see if there's some question that I want to answer.
Okay.
There's something which there's one on media trials. I think I'd like to attempt answer. And there's one by Rishjvi Parihar. So Mr. or Ms. Parihar says, can we say that society is in some way sympathizing with the offenders and victims, and judges find a middle path to give a punishment to the intellect of both sides? The whole point of judges' discretion is to have a middle path so that there is a balance. But the question is, in seeking to achieve the balance, individual elements of an offender and the crime are often and the victim are to be considered. When they are not appropriately considered is when there is a reaction to society, and the pragmatism of judges sometimes is not a philosophical pragmatism, but a human situation pragmatism. Once we have a coherent philosophy, the pragmatism will be better defined and it'll be more coherent, and that is what we need to look at. So far as Ms. Preeti Sivaraman, media trials influence proceedings and the gravity of the situation leading to harsher punishment. You think that after Nirbhaya and other cases, should a juvenile age 16 to 18 be tried as an adult? Okay. The first thing which you need to understand is, do media trials influence the proceedings? The answer is yes, they do. They also lead to situations where people plead for their innocence. For example, in the Talwar case, there was a media barrage in the Arushi Talwar that they are innocent. Whether they are or not is a matter for the Supreme Court to decide, because I understand SLPs are pending, but that's a separate issue. Secondly, keeping in view the specific age. Now, I must tell you, having been a prosecutor in that case, I did not look at the case of the juvenile specifically because I was not the lawyer in that. But what I understood from the case was that he was not necessarily the principal offender. This attempt to change the law to 16 to 18 was sought by Mr. Subramaniam Swamy in a seminal judgment, Subramaniam Swamy versus Raju. Following Salil Bali, the law was elaborated and said that there is no legal justification to increase the age from 16 to 18 years. Having said that, it has today been done, and that is the law of the land. I think time will tell whether we achieved the purpose or not, whether the statistics justify. When I did the Nirbhay, when I did Salil Bali and Subramaniam Swamy, in both cases I appeared for the state, the statistics did not justify a reduction of the age from 18 to 16. But today it's the law of the land, with discretion to the judge. That discretion is the subject matter of a case which is the name will just come to me. I just argued it before Justice Deepak Gupta, because there is one category of offences which has been totally left out. This is the case of the boy who drove over a child and was sought to be charged for 304. Now, that is the issue, is how will the person be tried, but that's a separate issue. There is another pending matter where this issue of how do you determine 16 to 18 years? What are the parameters? What are the medical tests? How do you decide whether the person has the fitness to be able to be tried as an adult? All these are legal conundrums which are yet to be determined. And only when it is determined will we know whether we've taken the right step forward. One of the biggest concerns I have, and I must share this with all of you, is we don't do legal audits. It's time in this country that there were legal audits of legislation, especially criminal legislation. We can't do it like the UK or the US, where they do it within 5 years because their systems are faster. But every 10 years or 15 years, it's time to see, if we brought in a criminal law, has it worked? Should we decriminalize? Should we depenalize? Should we increase the punishment? That's what needs serious consideration. I hope that some of your alumni and some of your students will take up these causes, because these are causes which you must take up.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I think we'll end it here. I'll collate whatever questions are left out and email them to you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for being here. I think we can end this now.
Thank you so much, Malvika.